Thank all of you for being here for this year-end conference, press conference. We're obviously closing out another busy and challenging year in Louisiana, and I can unequivocally state that we have made tremendous progress over the course of the year in stabilizing state government and make sure that we are more adequately and responsibly funding critical priorities. And we are seeing tangible benefits on every front from those efforts. And despite the challenges that continue to lie ahead, I remain extremely optimistic about the future of our great state and the fact that we are going to come together in order to meet these additional challenges and then enter into an era of prosperity that we haven't seen in Louisiana in a long time. And I have good reason to be this optimistic. First, it relates to jobs. I've often said and always believed that the very best social program is a job. And the only thing that beats a job is a career. And we're working on both fronts. And in fact, right now, Louisiana has the lowest employment that it's seen since May of 2008, and that's 4.8%, almost a full percentage point and a half lower than when I became governor. And there will be an additional announcement, I think, on Friday of this week about our employment numbers as it relates to November. And just based on my travels around the state and conversations with people, I will be surprised if that doesn't improve yet again. The largest economic development project in our state's history relative to permanent direct jobs at one site was announced recently in New Orleans, where DXC Technologies will invest significantly in the central business district of New Orleans, and in fact this week actually completed the lease agreement on the space that they will occupy in the Freeport McMoran building there on Poydras Street. But that announcement was for 2,000 permanent direct jobs and another 2,200 indirect jobs. And that's an indication of our state moving forward. We have plenty of reason to be optimistic that these job numbers are going to continue for some period of time based on the number of projects that have been announced and around the state, and the fact that we have more foreign direct investment in Louisiana than any other state in the nation. And that's extremely helpful as we move forward, especially when you consider that there are a couple sectors of our economy where we have the most jobs ever, and those are construction jobs and healthcare. And look, we know that there are other sectors of our economy and other geographic regions that are not doing as well. And so we certainly are not saying this mission accomplished. We got a long way to go, but we're going to continue to work on that. Thank you. Then the outlook for the state in terms of the fiscal condition is improving as well, and I think it's related largely to the job creation. It's been very helpful to have the jobs created, and we actually see some signs that wages are improving as well in order to stabilize the state's budget situation, but more importantly, the families that sit around those dinner tables, their particular situation is better as well. But the state ended last fiscal year on June 30th, 2017 with a projected surplus of somewhere between $122 and $129 million. Now, it's been a long time since the state of Louisiana talked about surplus. We did that despite the fact that was the year where we had the largest ever budget deficit projected going into it of over $2 billion, and we had to successfully and responsibly respond to 2 mid-year budget reductions in that fiscal year. We were able to do that, and working with all the folks in the administration, but most especially with the Commissioner, Jay Darden, in a very disciplined fashion, we were able to close that year out with the surplus that I just mentioned. More importantly, I suspect for most people is in the current year, we do not anticipate a mid-year deficit, and that'll be the first time in 8 years. So these are the benefits of stability, because mid-year cuts are especially harmful in terms of the state agencies, higher education, because they are disrupted so much by the turbulence that comes with mid-year cuts. And if the current projections hold up, there will not be a mid-year cut. And in fact, the revenue forecast for the current fiscal year was actually upgraded by the most recent REC meeting. And the revenue forecast for the fiscal year that starts July 1st of 2018 was also upgraded. Again, the first time in years that the REC has actually upgraded our forecast as opposed to downgrading it. And this is what it means to have that stability. This is just one example. For the first time in a decade, higher education was saved from cuts relative to the previous year in terms of state general fund support coming from the state to higher education. And we also fully funded the TOPS program. This has been a tremendous win for the state of Louisiana, but particularly for the students in Louisiana who want to stay here and get a first-rate education. And in fact, enrollment applications for next year are already at a record level in Louisiana, largely due to the progress that we have been able to make. The second point I want to make is it was our commitment in this past year to higher education that allowed us to win that economic development project of DXC Technologies, and going forward will allow us to land many more such projects, because these companies want to know that if they invest in Louisiana to either expand a current operation or to develop a new operation here, we're going to have the talent pipeline in place necessary that they know that they can have the skilled, educated workers that they need for success. And maintaining our support for higher education is critical if we're going to do this. We're also turning the tide on health care in Louisiana. A little over 450,000 working adult Louisianans will have health care this Christmas because of the Medicaid expansion. That expansion is saving lives, and it is also saving money. On the money side, under expansion today, we're spending 5 cents on the dollar at the state level to provide health care to these working poor individuals. And by the way, that bill will never exceed 10 cents on the dollar. And prior to expansion, we were spending about 40 cents on the dollar for the health care that was received by these individuals. As a result, we're actually going to save more than $300 million state general fund in the current fiscal year because of Medicaid expansion. And that is critically important, especially given the challenges that we've had around our budget. But more important to me is we are literally saving lives. Today, more than 500 individuals are receiving treatment just for 2 types of cancer that have been diagnosed in that Medicaid expansion population. Those are breast cancers and colon cancers. They would not have received the diagnosis when they did, and they would not be receiving treatment, but for the fact that that Medicaid card allowed them access to the diagnostic evaluations that they needed. Otherwise, those diseases are not diagnosed until much, much later when they present themselves to an emergency room and are found to have cancer. At such time, the treatment is much more expensive and it's less effective. So we know we are saving lives as well as money. I would just also mention that we've had 5,600 patients in the Medicaid expansion who've avoided cancer by receiving colonoscopies where they actually removed precancerous polyps. And I've said this before too, but I'll repeat it now. The same Catholic Christian faith that leads me to be pro-life on the issue of abortion tells me the Medicaid expansion is also the correct pro-life position. With respect to health care, we've also moved forward on combating the opioid epidemic that is affecting us here in Louisiana and so many around the country as well. In fact, opioid prescription limits that have been implemented by the Department of Health earlier this year have been successful in decreasing the number of opioid pills prescribed by more than 40% year over year for first-time users. This is critically important to preventing the addiction in the first place. And we also know that the number of prescriptions that are being issued by physicians and the number of pills being prescribed are both down by 2 and by 3% respectively. In the process of finalizing the agreement in Shreveport, as many of you know, because of an announcement we made yesterday, wherein we have a letter of intent that's been signed by LSU and Oxnard, where BRF, the current operator of the hospital there in Shreveport, we are all working so that Oxnard will become the operator of that hospital. We will stabilize. Would somebody give me some water, please? And I do apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather. But we're going to stabilize and strengthen both the hospital in Shreveport and the medical school. And this is consistent with my long-term stated commitment to making sure that medical school stays in Shreveport, and that we actually strengthen it over time as we are able to do so. And we also want to make sure that the very best possible care is being rendered in the hospital there in Shreveport. And we're excited about what this partnership will allow us to do going forward. Another thing that I'd like to mention is the fact that the Department of Children and Family Services continues to do very good work under difficult circumstances, given the budget constraints that agency continues to face. But DCFS was the lead agency in sheltering 2,400 neighbors from Texas during Hurricane Harvey. And by the way, it was an absolute first-class shelter, probably the best shelter operation that I have personally seen in my time involved in state government. And I did get a call from Governor Abbott in Texas, who told me that he had received reports of it as well, and he wanted me to express my thanks not just to that department, but to the people of Louisiana who were good neighbors when they needed it. And a lot of people don't know this, but we actually had first responders, National Guardsmen, state police, fire marshals officers, and officers of wildlife and fisheries who went into southeast Texas around Vidor, Orange, and Port Arthur, and actually rescued more than 3,000 Texans because the Texas authorities couldn't get to them. And certainly that's a highlight of our year as well. So I wanted to mention that, and then thank them so much for their work, but also to thank the Cajun Navy, who took individuals and boats further into Texas, primarily around the Houston area, and rescued so many more. That's what it means to be a neighbor. With respect to the Department of Children and Family Services, we also launched the Louisiana Fosters with the First Lady, and Donna's doing a great job with that. It connects fosters parents with the support systems they need in their communities, and it links government, faith groups, nonprofits, businesses, and community members in that effort. And also this year, we set another record for adoptions out of the foster care system, with 771 children adopted. This is the most ever in 1 year, and the previous record was last year. And that's what makes it especially noteworthy. Now, we've also made smarter investments on crime to make our communities safer. We changed the way we approach the public safety in Louisiana with bipartisan criminal justice reforms that passed overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate, focusing on nonviolent, non-sex offenders to reduce our incarceration rate and improve public safety, using strategies that have been effectively implemented in other southern conservative states. The implementation has gone smoothly, and we'll continue to work with our Criminal Justice Reform Oversight Council to further ensure proper implementation and that the reinvestment dollars are being used properly. This is going to be critically important because we still have, as you all know, this fiscal cliff looming, and the temptation will be there to take the dollars saved through the criminal justice reform efforts and just use those to meet the deficits. Well, that's not what we should do. That's not what the legislature said last year we should do, and we know that we're going to have to be disciplined and take 70% of those dollars and reinvest them into that system so that there are more alternatives to incarceration, there are more treatment opportunities for people with mental illness and addiction disorders, and more educational opportunities so that individuals do reenter society with a better chance to succeed. That will be critically important. We also know that next year Congress is going to consider criminal justice reforms at the national level, and there's no doubt that they will look to Louisiana and some other states for guidance in that effort. And in fact, just last month I was invited to the White House to brief several individuals there on our reform efforts here in Louisiana. So these are just some of the accomplishments that we've had this year. And as you all know, we've had more than our fair share of challenges, but we are meeting those challenges, and the next challenge we have to meet is the fiscal cliff. And I think most of you were with me earlier this week when we addressed the plan to fix the fiscal cliff. I'd like to do that obviously in a special session in February, and we will only call that special session, however, if there is an agreement in principle between myself and legislative leadership as to how we will address the cliff. I look forward to having more conversations with the Speaker and the President shortly after the new year, and we'll do everything that I can to make sure that we do reach that agreement and we can fix that problem in a special session. That's the most responsible way forward. And then once we are successful doing that, I look for Louisiana to have the stability and predictability that we're going to need going forward to make sure that we can invest in our critical priorities the way that we should, and that we have a tax structure that is actually designed such that as the economy grows, the revenue will grow too, so that we can increase those investments over time and not have the sustained period like we've had recently, where we've just had a dwindling amount of revenue with which to meet our most essential obligations and priorities. Now with that, I'm going to get another sip of water and I'm going to take your questions.
When you and your staff or the transition team decided to hire Johnny Anderson, what consideration do you give to the sexual harassment allegations from a decade ago?
Well, that they were allegations and that they had been investigated by Southern without any finding that he had committed any of those alleged those allegations, I guess I should say. Further, that he denied them, and that in my years of knowing Johnny, which go back to 2011, that I never saw, heard anything directly or indirectly that suggested to me that there would be any problem of this type. Now, having said that, obviously we take these allegations very seriously. We take the whole subject matter of sexual harassment very seriously, and as a result, within 15 hours of us learning that there were allegations, Mr. Anderson was called in. The situation was explained to him, and he resigned on the spot. There is an investigation that continues to proceed, and I'm not at liberty to go into that matter further, but we've also made sure that we stood up a group that within the executive branch of government will inventory all of the policies around sexual harassment, try to figure out where the weak points are, whether those policies are sufficient, whether they are sufficiently uniform across the executive branch of government, and whether we're doing everything that we can and should to make sure that supervisors and employees alike are knowledgeable of those policies and take advantage of whatever the provisions are when it comes to having the confidence that they need, that they can actually report instances like this, because there simply is no place for sexual harassment in the workplace in Louisiana, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector.
Governor, what are your thoughts on some of the allegations that surfaced within the last couple of months surrounding state police and your former commander, Mike Edmondson, and how do you see reforms moving forward for that agency?
Yeah, well, obviously very troubling. You know, I will tell you that I'm less than convinced that the legislative auditor got it right relative to the use of the residence by Colonel Edmondson. I've looked at the three-factor test. I know, I can't tell you what happened when my predecessor was governor, but I know that during the transition, he and I spoke about the residents, and I told him I expected him to stay in the residence because that's the best place for him to be if he's going to command the state police. So, you know, I think all three factors were met, and so I don't look at that particular conclusion of the legislative auditor's report with any real concern. But the rest of it obviously is very concerning, and an investigation was also done, as you all know, by the state police, internal affairs, which revealed a number of things that were improper. And I suspect, although I don't want to speak for him, that some of the things that were reported at least led to his decision to retire back in March earlier this year. And I will tell you that that retirement allowed me to select another superintendent, and Colonel Reeves is doing an excellent job. I have 100% confidence in Colonel Reeves and in his leadership abilities, in the changes that he's already made in the organization. I think the morale among state troopers has increased, and I believe the professionalism of that agency will be fully restored. And I obviously want to make sure that all the people in Louisiana have as much confidence in that organization as I do. Yes, ma'am.
Governor, you are eternally optimistic about solving the fiscal cliff. However, do you have a plan B and a plan C if you don't get agreement? If we roll with a budget that is indeed $1 billion short, do you intend to put on your jump boots and go all drill sergeant?
Well, look, if you're going to see an executive budget proposal for the next fiscal year on January the 19th. And that is the plan if we don't fix the cliff, because we are constitutionally obligated to deliver a balanced budget proposal. And that proposal will be premised upon a loss of revenue by $1 billion. And those cuts can only come from the discretionary state general fund portion of the overall budget. And that is only $3.5 billion. And as you all know, and it's been this way for many, many years, the only two sizable pots of money within the discretionary state general fund are higher education and health care. Precisely the two areas where people across the state of Louisiana tell me over and over again they don't want to see cuts. But you are going to see a balanced budget proposal that represents what it would look like if we take $1 billion out of that $3.5 billion. And it is so nasty. I want to tell you and all the people who are going to see this, hear this, or read about this press conference, that budget will not be one that I want to implement, but it's the one I'm constitutionally obligated to deliver. And as a result, at the same time that we present that budget proposal, we will tell the legislature what it is that we want them to do to generate the revenue necessary to not have to make those cuts, and how we would take that revenue and plug it into the budget. And that actually is the same plan that I delivered earlier this week. And the good news is we're not looking for net new revenue. I'm not asking for more tax revenue next year than this year. That ought to make it somewhat easier to be successful. And I look forward to working with the legislature, and I will be as flexible as I can be and as open-minded as I can be in order to be successful. But there are certain things that we ought to do. We ought to allow that fifth penny to roll off the books as scheduled, because it is a regressive form of taxation. It was put on for a limited amount of time, and the stated purpose for that limitation was that over the 27 months that it was in effect, the legislature would study and adopt comprehensive long-term structural tax reform. Now it's time to do that. In fact, it's past time to do that. We should have done it in the fiscal session last year, when not a single bill containing the recommendations of the legislatively created task force actually moved out of the Ways and Means Committee to be considered by the House as a whole. I don't know how to be more fair than to give the legislature its own plan. This came from the legislative task force. So I'm actually optimistic that we're going to get it done. I hope we will get it done in February, but if not, we will do it in June, because I don't believe there's any way the legislature will pass a budget that reflects $1 billion in cuts. It's just not going to happen. And so we will have an ugly 3-month session where we don't pass a budget, in all likelihood, would not pass capital outlay, and then you have about a 3-week window after that session and before the start of the next fiscal year to actually fix the cliff, pass the budget, and pass capital outlay. That's not the way we should do business. The people of Louisiana deserve better from us, and the options will not be different, and they will not be better at the end of June than they are now. And again, we're not asking for more revenue. We want a revenue neutral solution. And I would ask everybody else to also be mindful, I should say, that the amount of state general fund that the state has this year, in the current fiscal year, is $1 billion less than we had 10 years ago. It was $10.4 billion 10 years ago. It is $9.4 billion this year. And without fixing this cliff, it will be $8.4 billion next year. And that would prevent us from maintaining the stability, for example, that we've enjoyed recently with higher education. It will compromise our abilities to land economic development wins and job creation going forward, as well as to deliver a whole host of state services relative to the partner hospitals, relative to optional Medicaid services, the ability to house inmates and to do all sorts of things that we as a state do and that the people of Louisiana rely upon us for. And so that's sometimes, the optimism comes not so much because you believe people will look at things differently than they have in the past, but because they're just going to be that much closer to the edge of the cliff. And it creates a sense of urgency. And I believe that that's something that we should take advantage of. Yes, sir.
Speaking on your budget or your tax plan, do you have any updates on the brackets now that we have a better sense of what Congress is going to be passing this week? And do you have any thoughts on the congressional tax bill?
Well, generally speaking, we know that if there is a federal tax cut for corporations and for individuals, that the income tax to Louisiana from corporations and individuals, that revenue should increase. That's because we have deductions for those taxes that are paid. And so if you pay less taxes, then the deduction gets smaller, they'll pay more state taxes. It is too early to have the models that you need to estimate what the impact will be because of these changes. And it's my understanding that even last night, some additional changes were made, and they actually have to go back and vote again in the U.S. House of Representatives. But we're going to be working on that. And as soon as we know what the impact is, obviously that could help us resolve a portion of the cliff. But there's several questions involved. One is not only how much additional revenue the state will get, but when that will happen. One of the things that I've always been willing to do is to use some part of that fifth penny of sales tax as a bridge to the new structure. And the new structure would relate both to the structure that we create by legislation here, but also what they're going to do in Congress and in fact are doing in Congress. And so once we can figure out if there's additional revenue that we will receive because of the tax cut bill that appears will be passed into law today, and when that will take place, then I can agree to extend some portion of the penny to bridge us until that actually happens. And so those are the only comments that I have right now. I will tell you, though, it is a very large bill. This is the most significant tax change legislation in 3 decades, and it is not at all clear exactly how it will impact the state of Louisiana. But we will be able to learn more over time, and as soon as we do, we will certainly share that information with you all, because it's going to be critically important that when we present that balanced budget proposal on January the 19th, that we take this into consideration. And so I've asked Secretary Kimberly Robinson at the Department of Revenue to make sure that she's on a timeline, if at all possible, so that we have a good estimate of the amount of revenue that we can expect to come to the state as a result of what they're doing in Congress and when. And by the way, I should probably tell you this. I've said for a long time that if we don't have an agreement to fix the cliff, I'm not going to call a special session in February. I don't want to call a special session just for the sake of calling it. When you need 70 votes to do things, if you don't have legislative leadership on board, it's very difficult to get it done. And the time that I'm going to put on that will be January the 19th, the day we present our executive budget proposal to the legislature. If we don't have an agreement by that date, I don't expect that I'll be calling a special session in February. Yes, ma'am.
Governor, right now there are multiple reviews of the state's sexual harassment policies in place, including the task force that you've appointed. Given the resignation of Mr. Anderson and also your 8 years that you were in the state legislature, I'm curious what your thoughts are. Do you think that there is a sexual harassment problem in state government in Louisiana?
Well, what I know is that human beings work in state government just like they work in the private sector, just like they work at news organizations, different, whether it's in academic settings or in entertainment. And if you just look at the headlines from around the country, you see that there are no boundaries beyond which these things, can't penetrate. And so I would say that we have a problem in government just like anywhere else. But we have probably a special obligation to make sure that we're doing all that we can. And we are concentrated on doing that going forward for sure. And I see where the legislature is also studying the rules that they have and see whether they're as robust as they need to be. I think that's happening both in the House and the Senate. We're going to do it at our level as well. And I would encourage local government to make sure that they are doing the same.
Last question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering if, I know that there are certain requirements on how you have to spend part of the 120 million surplus, but there is a lot of money that you have wiggle room with how you can decide to spend it. Have you set up an idea of where you want to spend those dollars yet? Do you have priorities? Do you want to refill all the money borrowed from the rainy day fund, or do you have other ideas for how it should be used?
Well, we have a certain percentage that has to go to the rainy day fund. A certain percentage has to go to the UAL. And beyond that, you have flexibility, but only within certain areas. And I'm not yet ready to make a recommendation on that, but we're actually, that'd be one of the things we're going to be working with the legislature on. And, I believe that there was actually some legislation passed last year that may further limit what we can do with the surplus beyond what those traditional limits were. And I would refer you to legislation that Representative Henry passed, and so those are further limitations that we have, which is one of the reasons we want to make sure that we're working with the legislature on that. We have no shortage of needs, and while it's so much better to have a $120 million surplus than $120 million deficit, for example, it's very important that we do the most, that we get the most bang for the buck, is I guess what I should say. And we're going to be working with the legislature to get that done. I want to thank all of you for being here and wish you all a Merry Christmas and the very best New Year in 2018 for you and your families, and certainly for the state of Louisiana. God bless you.